Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the Metamorphosis of Plants, written in 1790 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great poet, playwright, novelist, statesman, theater director, and critic who was also a great scientist. My guest is Rolf Sattler, who is an emeritus professor of biology at McGill University in Montrael, Canada, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He is a specialist in plant morphology and is the author of the award-winning book Organogenesis of Flowers. Also, Biophilosophy, Analytic, and Holistic Perspectives, as well as nearly 100 scientific papers. He's taught a course on biology and Zen at the Naropa Institute in Colorado and has also given an invited lecture on the life sciences and spirituality in honor of the Dalai Lama's 60th birthday. His newest book is Science and Beyond, Toward Greater Sanity Through Science, Philosophy, Art, and Spirituality. Rolf lives in Ontario, Canada, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Rolf. It's a real pleasure to be with you for our third interview.
Well, the pleasure is mine, Jeff. I really enjoyed our previous interviews, and I'm very much looking forward to this one.
Well, this one will be a little bit different because we're talking about a historical figure, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who lived in the latter half of the 18th century into the early part of the 19th century. And I think it's fair to say, at least when I grew up studying German in high school, I'm pretty sure Goethe was regarded as one of the very greatest of all German thinkers.
Oh, yes, definitely. I think what Shakespeare is to the English, Goethe is to the Germans, or what Dante is to the Italians, Goethe is to the Germans. Yes. He's
largely remembered as a poet and a dramatist and a novelist. His work, Faust, for example, is considered one of the great classics of global dramatic literature.
Yes, yes. But he regretted that he was not equally recognized as a scientist because he considered his scientific investigations as important as his dramatic work and poetry.
I think it's very interesting that somebody who would have attained the very heights of poetic and dramatic and literary insights also delved into science. And my best guess is that this would make his approach to science very different from that of most other scientists.
His empiricism or his empirical approach is often referred to as a delicate empiricism, in contrast to the common empiricism, which is not so delicate, which could at times even be considered violent. So Goethe's delicate empiricism emphasizes empathy with the object one studies and intuition, and also imagination and a merging of the observer and the observed. So it's very different from ordinary empiricism, where the emphasis is on a hypothesis that then is tested through facts and observations. There's a modern geneticist, actually a Nobel laureate, Barbara McClintock. She also studied her objects. She studied mainly corn. she also emphasized that she was merging with her objects when she was studying them, and she referred to having a feeling for the organism. So this is very different from ordinary approach to science, which at times often can be rather more or less violent. So for this reason, Goethe stands out, and one actually refers to Goethean science, which refers to this delicate empiricism. But then at the same time, I should also mention that Goethe was not just caught in that kind of approach. He also recognized the more common approach. So he embraced both. And that's very characteristic for Goethe, I think. He was not just one-sided, just caught in one view, one worldview. He embraced so many. In fact, a colleague of mine in France, Gérard Cusset, he referred to, I quote, the all-embracing Goethe. So that, I think, is very characteristic for Goethe. And unfortunately, this is often not seen. There are many modern philosophers and scientists, when they think of Goethe, they just think of the delicate empiricism, which is very important. Another thing that was very important to Goethe is what he called intuitive judgment. Intuitive judgment means, again, like a merging with the object and an emphasis on intuition. And then he thought that through this merging, he could actually intuit the idea, the essence behind the form. And so in this sense, he is an essentialist. But again, he's not only an essentialist, he even deconstructed his essentialism at times. And so I think one could even consider him a forerunner of postmodernism, perspectivism, because he could see so many perspectives and he could see that each one is somewhat limited and needs other perspectives to be more inclusive, become more inclusive, more comprehensive.
So this view you've just described as perspectivism, I understand that that's a term that was actually coined by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes, it was coined by Nietzsche. But I think there were perspectivists before Nietzsche. He just coined the term, and he emphasized, of course, very much perspectivism. But as I just said, Goethe can also be considered a perspectivist, and other philosophers long before him. Even Plato, I think one could consider a perspectivist, because what we normally consider Platonic, which refers to his the idea of eternal forms that don't change and that are the real essence of things. This is one idea he had, and which I think he even he was critical about it and even forgot about it at the end of his life. And yet that's all many people know about Plato. And so he embraced also many different perspectives. In fact, Whitehead said, you probably know that quote, that the whole of Western philosophy is just footnotes on Plato. So, perspectivism started very early. And unfortunately, what's often forgotten, like with Goethe, is that one of the predominant ideas is considered to be characteristic of him, and the others are ignored or forgotten or not recognized, which I think is very unfortunate.
I'm not sure that I understand perspectivism completely, but I have heard the idea expressed that there is no such thing as a privileged perspective, that every perspective is equal in the sense that they all represent the point of view of the beholder.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that they are equal. I think one perspective could be much more comprehensive than another one. Yet the less comprehensive one could show something that the more comprehensive one doesn't show. I often use as an example, near Montrael, where I lived for a long time, we have a mountain, and if you take an aerial view of that mountain, of course, you can see a lot more than if you just stand on one side where it's very steep and on the other side where it's very gently sloping. So these would be different perspectives, whereas each one, of course, valid to some extent, but dependent on the standpoint, on the perspective. So if one takes an aerial view, one can see both the steep incline and the gentle one. And so that perspective is more comprehensive. But then there is a gorge there. And I think this gorge you cannot see from an aerial view. So that perspective of the gorge, which is a narrow perspective, is not revealed in the very broad one. And so it also has a certain validity. So I would say all perspectives, whether broad, comprehensive, or narrow, have a certain validity.
I was first introduced to Goethe in a serious way through the work of Rudolf Steiner. Now, Steiner is a fascinating figure because he was an academic philosopher, but he's mostly remembered as a mystic and the father of a school of thought known as anthroposophy, which is basically esoteric, Western esotericism. And Steiner studied the Goethe archives in particular. I think he worked on Goethe's scientific writings. And to my understanding, Goethe's scientific writings are right at the very heart of the anthroposophical teachings of Rudolf Steiner. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I agree with that very much. But unfortunately, Steiner also had a very one-sided view of Goethe, because to him, Goethe was just delicate empiricism, intuitive judgment, and he did not see that Goethe also embraced other points of views, other worldviews, and so on. So I think it's very unfortunate that Steiner, who really promulgated Goethe very much, reinforced this one-sidedness. Unfortunate, I think.
The point that you make in an essay that I've read, as a matter of fact, I believe it was a keynote address at a symposium sponsored by the anthroposophists, is that Goethe also had a deep appreciation of mechanistic thinking.
Yes. I mean, he was more drawn towards the organic, organismic thinking, definitely, but he would not discount completely mechanistic thinking. He said there is also a role for that. And in fact, one can discover many things through mechanistic thinking. So again, in this respect, Goethe was a perspectivist. And although he was more drawn to one, he still recognized that there was a place for the other one too. And Steiner would not admit that, I think. Steiner would just emphasize the organismic and holistic tendency that, of course, was very strong in Goethe.
Now, the organismic tendency that you referred to, or the holistic tendency, would you say that's the same as understanding that the universe itself is alive?
I'm not sure whether I would say that, but the universe is a whole, is one integrated whole. And that's very different from mechanism, according to which it consists of separate parts that interact with each other.
Maybe what I'm trying to get at might be better described as animism.
Yes, and animism, Goethe also embraced animism. For Goethe, everything was animated, and he even referred to a world soul. So yes, that's another perspective that is very much recognized by Goethe.
Your professional career is as a plant morphologist, and as I recall earlier, you told me that Goethe is considered the father of plant morphology.
I would say one of them, because there was also there were others who were, I think, equally influential. For example, A.P.D. Candolle, a contemporary of Goethe, who was born in Geneva in Switzerland and then moved to France, to Paris, I think. He developed an idea very similar, or in one way maybe almost identical, to what Goethe proposed in his Metamorphosis of Plants. So, and there were forerunners also, but many contemporary morphologists who appreciate Goethe, they would consider Goethe as the real father, and probably because they don't know enough about de Candolle and others. But his work, his little book, The Metamorphosis of Plants, actually at first he called it an attempt to explain the metamorphosis of plants. Later on, he just called it the Metamorphosis of Plants. This booklet has had an enormous influence, and up to the present time, because in the 20th century, one German morphologist, Wilhelm Troll, who was extremely influential, not only in Germany, but in Europe and worldwide. He took over Goethe's idea which he proposed in his booklet. And then an American, a very influential American morphologist, Donald Kaplan, who taught at the University of California at Berkeley, he adopted also that view. Maybe he was not an essentialist because he was interested in evolution, but he used the same categories as Goethe in his original work. And so up to the present time, morphology is still dominated by this view and by these categories that he introduced in his essay.
One of the concepts that Steiner emphasized very much in Goethe's writings is the notion of the Urplant, or the archetypal plant. I guess that would be consistent with the notion of essentialism, that there's some sort of, or a Platonic ideal underlying each plant.
Exactly, yes. That's the Urplant is an essential form, really, and all the plants we observe are manifestation of this essential form. And again, a lot of emphasis has been placed on this idea of the Urplant, and Goethe referred to it very few times, very little. Even in his Metamorphosis of Plants, as far as I know, he did not refer to Urplant. So that's an interesting idea, but interesting thing. But in his Metamorphosis of Plants, he referred to an essential form, namely the leaf. The leaf was to him an essential form. And so in that sense, his Metamorphosis of Plant really was based on essentialism. And when he refers to the leaf, he refers to all the lateral appendages of a plant. In a plant, you have a stem, and then on the stem, you get first the seed leaves, then the foliage leaves, then when you get to the flower, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, the carpels. All of these are lateral appendages, and Goethe called all of them leaves. And to him, they were all the same organ. All of them were essentially the same organ. They just manifested differently. So you can see a very essentialistic view that he proposed in his Metamorphosis of Plants.
And in the history of Goethe, there's a famous incident in which he met another great German author, Schiller, and the two of them spent an evening together discussing the Urplant. And as I recall, the story goes that Schiller got indignant and he said to Goethe, "That's not an observation, it's just an idea." And Goethe responded by saying, "No, it's more than just an idea, I can see it."
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's typical for Goethe, that he thought through looking at a plant or at forms, he could intuit the idea behind it. And Schiller, of course, like Kant, debated that this is possible because, according to them, there is always a duality between what's observed through the senses and what is thought, the ideas. And it's interesting, when Goethe wrote only a short essay on intuitive judgment, in which he, as I said already, in which he thought that he could, from sensory appearance, sensory perception, he could intuit the idea. But just 1 year after he wrote that essay on intuitive judgment, he came to a very different conclusion. He recognized that there remains a conflict between observation through the senses and between the thought and the idea. And I quote, he wrote, the dual between the perceived and the ideated remains forever unresolved. So he contradicted his idea of intuitive judgment. And it is interesting. Then he said, to alleviate this conflict, he took flight to poetry, and then he concluded that nature's most worthy interpreter is art. That's an interesting statement. These are kinds of quotations you don't find in the literature, or I haven't come across them. I got them directly from Goethe, and I find it's unfortunate that this is so often neglected. And this again shows, that although he was so much attracted to intuitive judgment, he recognized, that there's a problem, and that this problem remains unresolved. And so that maybe a resolution, if any, is art, through art.
Rolf, I've done a number of interviews with contemporary scientists, typically in psychology, but not exclusively, also parapsychology and even physics, on the topic of synesthesia, the ability, for example, to hear color or to see sounds. That is, the sensory input from what we think of as one source becomes displayed in the mental sensorium differently than most people experience it. And it would seem that this might account for the paradox that Goethe found himself in. And as I read through your paper, I noticed that you refer to yourself as someone who sees auras, which is also often attributed to synesthesia.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's definitely very interesting. But even that does not necessarily reveal the idea or the essence behind everything. And in fact, there may be no essence. And I have been very critical of essentialism, because I think a lot of empirical research, especially also research carried out in my lab, showed that there are not distinct essences. It's a continuum between everything, it seems. So you cannot say a leaf has this essence and the stem has another essence and the root has another essence. Even Goethe at one point wrote, all is leaf. That means even the stem and the root is leaf. They just have a different a different symmetry. Stems and leaves are radial, whereas stems and roots are radial, whereas leaves are flattened. So then, if all is leaf, then of course there's no longer a separate essence of the leaf and the stem and the root. And so he in a way deconstructed essentialism, which I find fascinating. And this is very often not known or not recognized.
Now, I gather, especially from your work, that the idea of essentialism goes back probably to the pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, who might have said everything is fire, or another one would say everything is air, everything is water, to try and find out what is the essential element from which everything else arises.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but if we say everything is fire, like if we say everything is leaf, I don't see so much a problem there. I see the problem when we distinguish different essences like leaf, stem, and root, because then we fragment one whole into separate essences. Even with Plato, I see a problem when he refers to three major essences: the true, the good, and the beautiful. If we separate these three, well, I think we fragment, and I see a problem there. I see a general problem in fragmentation because, as you know, I'm very holistically oriented, and I think we have more and more evidence for interconnectedness of everything. And so I found this interconnectedness through my scientific research. And of course, other scientists, especially physicists, quantum physicists, have found this interconnectedness through their research. But I also find this wholeness through my meditation, I must say. So I find it objectively through research and subjectively through my meditation. And so I find it very convincing, that there are not separate essences that fragment the whole of reality.
People who work in your discipline of plant morphology have a bit of a different approach to the world than other scientists. And maybe this has something to do with Goethe's influence or something to do with the time that you spend studying plants.
Yes, maybe one reason is that we are very much we emphasize very much the visual aspect, whereas in, for example, chemistry, you don't observe the molecules and the atoms. You see reactions, and so in a way, a morphologist maybe is closer to things than a chemist. I'm not sure, but I've been attracted to morphology because I am fascinated by the manifoldness of forms, plant forms, and the visual aspect, and becoming totally immersed in that can actually lead beyond it. And so not necessarily to essences, but beyond maybe to the wholeness of everything. So yeah, I think there is something to morphology that maybe other more abstract sciences don't offer.
And if I may, I'd like to come back to the statement that you made in your paper on Goethe, that you also happen to see auras. And I wonder, has that actually been a factor in the scientific work that you do? When you look at a plant, do you see something different about the plant?
Well, I can see auras around plants, but I developed this ability only very late in my life, actually after my retirement. It was interesting. For many years, I taught a course in philosophy of biology, and there I told my students that that some people can see auras, and they asked me, "Can you?" And I had to admit, no, I cannot. And they found that a bit strange. I'm talking about things that I cannot see myself. So yes, I think as a result of more meditative practice, I eventually could see auras. But I actually don't attach a lot of importance to that. Although I find it interesting from a point of view of philosophy of science. You know that in science, objectivity is considered very important. And what is objectivity? Well, many people think something is objective if it's real, but we don't really know what is real. So this notion of objectivity, objectivity as being reality, is not very useful in science. I think what we mean by objectivity in science is shared perception. So if we see the same thing, then we consider that objective. But what we consider the same thing when we see the same thing, that depends on our state of consciousness. So that means most people who are in a similar state of consciousness, they can see the same thing. But someone else who is in a different, maybe extraordinary state of consciousness can see something else. So if everyone else could achieve this state of consciousness, then seeing auras, for example, would become objective. So you can see that's very relative in a way, what's considered objective, because it's dependent on our state of consciousness. And you may know Charles Tart, who studied a lot of also parapsychological phenomena, and he suggested that we should have a state-specific sciences. So if you are in one state, then you can have a certain kind of science. If you're in another state, then you have another kind of science. And I think the common science that we have nowadays relies very much on an ordinary state of consciousness, and unfortunately disregards a lot extraordinary states of consciousness.
Well, incidentally, Charles Tart was one of my own dissertation committee members on my doctoral program at Berkeley, and I do have an interview with him on state-specific science. I'm going to link to it. Our viewers can look at the upper right of their screen and link to that interview. You're certainly right. In your essay, you list 9 different world views, and you suggest that Goethe is all-embracing. You can find all of those world views in Goethe.
Well, as you know, in mysticism, the emphasis is on oneness. And so Goethe very often referred to oneness, and that we are one with everything. And in that sense, I consider him a mystic. And he even went beyond that. I think he also was a non-dualist, because he said, I have that somewhere written down. He said, know the one as the many. So he didn't make this dichotomy between the one and the many. To him, the one and the many were again one. So that to me is also highly significant.
As I recall, you also draw upon Buddhism and the notion that emptiness is form and form is emptiness.
Yes, that's also non-dualist, because they are not different. And that, to me, is very important, this recognition, because there is often many people are caught in dualisms, and this, again, to me, is a fragmentation, which I don't think is real.
And yet we seem to live in a universe where we see separate objects everywhere. I'm sitting in a studio. I'm looking at a computer screen. Your image is on the screen. There are cameras and lights, and they all seem distinct from each other. I think most people assume in the everyday world that it is full of a multiplicity of objects.
People who can see auras, they don't see objects as separate entities, because through auras everything is interconnected. And even in science, we know that we have infrared radiation beyond our bodies, and so in both science and in personal experience, one can actually see beyond the separateness. But in most cases, we see things as separate, and we also grow up and are educated in this way, because I think language also reinforces this separateness, because we refer to this and to that and give a name to it, and to you and to me, and all language really fragments very much, and in this way it reinforces this notion of separateness.
And of course, we've done a previous interview on general semantics and the work of Alfred Korzybski, where that concept is emphasized. And I know Korzybski's been a big influence on you, like Goethe.
Yes. Oh, yes. I think it's really has been very important. And to me, it's so evident that language is limited. Language is useful, we need it, but it's limited, and we have to go beyond language, and reality cannot be described through language. As Korzybski said, it's the unspeakable, or I refer to the unnameable, and then of course you come to silence, and so it's very important to be silent. And silence also was important to Goethe. It was very important to Korzybski, and it's of course very important to many meditators and people who go out into nature and feel the awe in nature. They become silent. I once went with a little child, very talkative child, into a wood forest, and I was so surprised. Suddenly he said, "Oh, let's not talk, just listen, just watch." So it's amazing. It's amazing, really.
One of the interesting things about Goethe is he's considered one of the fathers of the German Romantic movement, and it was very important for all the German Romantics, as I understand it, to be in nature and to merge with nature, to become one with nature. It was really, I think one might say, a large-scale mystical movement.
Yes, oh yes, I think he was a real romantic in a way, because feeling was very important to him, not only thinking. And to me, that's very characteristic of romantics.
And another thing about Goethe we haven't talked about, I wonder if you have any thoughts about his work on optics. I know Goethe and Newton both looked at optics and the nature of light and color and came up with very different conclusions.
Yes, unfortunately, I do not know too much about his optics, but it's a very different view from Newton's. And there are scientists, for example, like the physicist Heisenberg, who said that these are complementary views. One cannot say that Newton was right, Goethe was wrong, or vice versa. They complement each other, and that to me makes a lot of sense. Before we come to a close of our interview, if I may, I would like to summarize once more Goethe's views on plants.
Yes.
He had, contrary to what many people think, that he just proposed a root, stem, leaf model of plants, which I call a Trinitarian model. Trinitarian models seem to be very attractive, very appealing. I don't know why, but you find trinities all over. You find them in molecular biology, DNA, RNA, protein. You find them in religion. You find them all over. And so Goethe, one of his views of plants was a Trinitarian view, that plants consist of three basic kinds of organs, roots, stems, and leaves. But that was only one of his views. He had at least three other ones. And one other one is already proposed, the second one in his Metamorphosis of Plants, because he recognized that compound leaves, I have one here, maybe, can you see that? Yeah, this Beautiful. Is a compound leaf of sumac. Goethe, not in his Metamorphosis of Plants, but later on, said that this is actually not just a leaf, it's more like a branch. Now, if this is a branch, then of course it's not essentially a leaf. And so this contradicts what he said, what he wrote in his Metamorphosis of Plants. And this is very interesting, this idea that compound leaves tend to be more like branches was further developed by Casimir de Candolle at the end of the 19th century, and in the 20th century, especially by Agnes Arber, who referred to the partial shoot theory of the leaf, that the leaf is a partial shoot or compound leaves, partial shoot or partial branch. And again, Goethe recognized that already, not in his Metamorphosis of Plants, but in other comments. So that is another view he had, which coincides very much with Agnes Arber's view. That is not very popular, even to the present day. So that's a second view he had. And third view I mentioned already when he said all is leaf, that there's only one kind of form and that manifests in different ways, as roots, as stems, as leaf, what have you. So that also is very much neglected. And actually, when he proposed that, he did not say, this is my intuition. He proposed it as a hypothesis, so which shows that he also embraced the hypothetical general thinking of mainstream science. And then a fourth view is interesting. Maybe I can illustrate that with this passport branch. He had two different definitions in his Metamorphosis of Plants, two different definitions of a leaf. One, the common one that is usually only known, is this, that a leaf is this, the stem is this here. Can you see it? Yeah. The stem is this here, and then the leaf is this, and there's another leaf, and there's another leaf. But then he had a second definition of the leaf, according to which the leaf actually comprises also the stem segment below it. So everything from here to here is one leaf, and then below from here to here is another leaf. And then that means there's no longer a stem, right? There are only leaves.
I see.
So this is another idea he proposed. This idea one can find already in his Metamorphosis of Plants. So he had at least these four different views, two different views of the leaf, what's a leaf, and then also this partial shoot theory and of the leaf, and then the idea that all is leaf and that there's no fragmentation at all. And apart from his Trinitarian view, that's very strong in his Metamorphosis of Plants, these other views are really not much known. And the Trinitarian view has taken over, especially because of the enormous influence of Wilhelm Troll in Germany and Donald Kaplan in America and others also.
Well, you know, just as Einstein developed his theory of relativity by imagining what it would be like to be traveling at the speed of light, to become a photon, essentially, I get the impression that Goethe was asking himself, what is it like to be a plant? What is it like to be a leaf?
Yes, very much so. And another thing I want to mention that's also very important discovery by Goethe is he looked at the development of plants and how the leaves, whichever way you define them, change during the development. And so he noticed that the first leaves formed are very small. Then they become larger and larger, like, for example, even this leaf, right? And then again, when you come to the flower, to the sepals are much smaller again. And then the petals get larger again. Stamens get smaller again. So what he recognized are phases of expansion and contraction. And I think that's a very important discovery by him, and a very general principle, because it applies not only to plants, but I think this one could say almost is a universal principle, contraction and expansion, these two forces. And two other very important concepts that he introduced was the idea of polarity, which is, of course, also a very general, you could say universal notion and phenomenon. And then he introduced the idea of enhancement, that there's, during the development of the plant, from the vegetative region to the flower, there is an enhancement, because he considered it as a flower more developed, more enhanced than just the vegetative region. And this, of course, plays also a very important role in his Faust, because, you know, striving is very important in his Faust, Faustian striving, and towards something better, towards something more enhanced. So this we find in his plant morphology, and these are very general principles, I think, that are very interesting. To me, you know, I'm very interested in Taoism. They resonate very much also with Taoism and yin yang, so that's fascinating to me.
You have these opposing forces of growth and decay going on.
Yes, yes.
So there's also the question with regard to plants would be the death of a plant and that whole process.
Yes, oh yes. And again, it's this cyclic renewal from growth to decay and expansion, contraction. So this fluidity, Goethe was very much a dynamic thinker. To him, everything was change. He said, nature is eternal change. So that was also a very important principle to him.
When I visited the Anthroposophical Center in Dornach, Switzerland, what impressed me there is they had programs for children, and also in the Waldorf schools run by anthroposophists, that a young child was expected to kind of take care of a plant and to watch it grow, and then to watch as eventually it becomes an old plant and dies, so that the whole process of growth and efflorescence and then decay and death becomes sort of internalized by young children.
Yes, oh yes, I think that's very important, and I think they do great work in this respect. And in this way, I think we also avoid a sort of almost paranoid view of death in our society. Death is the enormous enemy, but death is something in old age, I mean, is something very natural, and it's very difficult to accept that in our mainstream society. So in this respect, yeah, I think Goethe and anthroposophists have made great contributions.
Well, one of the other important insights that I learned through anthroposophy, looking at Goethe, was that he seemed to see a kind of parallel between the plant and the poem. Both the plant and the poem have an underlying essence. And I think Goethe's point, at least as expressed through Steiner, was that this essence, the Urplant, the archetypal plant, and the archetypes that underlie poetry and drama are ultimately the same. They come from the same, I guess you would have to call it the same ontological level of archetypes.
I can see that, but I'm a little bit also skeptical about archetypes. Maybe archetypes are to some extent abstractions from reality. So although they represent an important aspect of reality, I don't consider them as ultimately real.
I see. I guess that would mean you're not a Jungian.
Well, I think he has made great contributions. And as I said, he discovered an important aspect of reality. But there is still a difference to me between an aspect of reality and reality itself, which is to me the unnameable.
Well, once again, Rolf Sattler, this has been a very stimulating discussion. I so much appreciate your passion for the work that you've spent your whole career on, plant morphology, but also the underlying dynamics and principles, the worldviews that support the work that you do, and your appreciation for the complex multiplicity of worldviews that all come together. Rolf, once again, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate immensely having this conversation with you.
That was truly a wonderful conversation.
Oh, yeah, I enjoyed it. I think it's such a pleasure having an interview with you. I mean, it just flows, and it goes into so many interesting aspects, and it's just wonderful.
And for those of you watching and listening, thank you for being with us.